All right. Hi, guys. So, I wanted to talk about poetry, and like with fiction, I wanted to try to reduce this down to as simple a rule or set of rules as possible. I have a long introduction to poetry that I could give, but I don't think that for this video I'm going to do that. Mostly what I want to say is that fiction is, it's 200 years old the way that we write it. American fiction is a relatively new form, but poetry is ancient. It goes back to before recorded history, but it's still based on rules, except that the rules are specific to individual moments, little communities, little cultures. And so, what we're going to do is look at a rule that makes current contemporary American poetry work. What we have to realize is that, with fiction, the rule is a character makes a decision, and the decision creates a sense of contrast. So things are different in the beginning of a story than they are at the end of a story. And American contemporary poetry is similarly interested in the idea of contrast. Now, this isn't to say this is exclusive to American contemporary poetry, but it's very, very especially important right now. And the way that American contemporary poetry achieves contrast is through what's called lineation. This is what poems are made of. They're made of lines. So, in order to explore this, I thought I would share with you a favorite poem of mine. So, this is obviously a car body shop out on Jackson Road, and they've had this sign up now for a couple of years, and I think it's kind of brilliant, and I wanted to talk about how lines or lineation make it brilliant. All right? So, the first line, your wife is hot. Get her windows tinted. Your wife is hot. Get her windows tinted. A line break frames the line. Whatever is in the line is considered by itself. So when we look at the first line of this poem, your wife is hot, the line stands alone, and we're asked to imagine its meaning by itself. And then we read, get her windows. And it's interesting because it sits in contrast to that line. And once, we imagine that your wife is hot, and obviously hot can mean multiple things. And so when it says get her windows, it's a kind of joke, like your wife is very hot in terms of temperature, and so get her a window, as in open a window to cool her off. Tinted. So a line break forces one line to contrast with the following line. And we're asked to consider how one line changes the previous line, and the way of thinking of the poem evolves across that change. So we go back to the poem. Your wife is hot. Get her windows tinted. So we take your wife is hot and get her windows, and obviously you can still be stuck in this frame of mind where she's hot because of temperature. Her windows are an object to be acquired. Like she doesn't have windows and you should get them for her. But of course, we can also take it, your wife is hot, as in she's a beautiful person. She's beautiful. She's sexually desirable. And get her windows. Do something to the windows. Tint them. So a line break, it holds two thoughts apart, and then it allows them to merge. So you have the two thoughts, you have them separately, and then they collapse in the mind. And now you have a third thought that's created by the lines collapsing. Now, obviously what I'm doing, I'm going through the poem very slowly. These things happen instantaneously or nearly instantaneously in the reader's mind. But the effect is still real. The pauses between the lines creating gaps, and then the gaps are closing. And the consequence is poetry. That's what makes a kind of beautiful, unexpected, contrasting image of language. And so once those first two lines coalesce into singular meaning, and then the third line clarifies that meaning, we end up with something like this, where the first two lines have become a meaningful unit, and now it's the third line which is contrasting with the previous lines. And this is really important. The effect of lineation isn't just happening from one line to the next, but it's happening once you coalesce lines together with the next line. And so this kind of building of meaning is stumbling through the poem, so that we get your wife is hot, get her windows tinted. And now tinted by itself is acting in opposition to the previous lines, and something of the joke of the poem becomes clear. You're not concerned as to whether or not your wife is cool or comfortable. Your concern is that other people not see her. Your concern is that she be protected. And so a line that starts in the beginning that feels as though you're thinking of your wife as human, as an individual person worthy of concern, by the end she becomes an object. She becomes a thing to be locked away like gold or precious gems. The contrasting and merging effects of line breaks happen between two lines, but also can happen between any two set of contrasting elements. So in just one three-line poem, each line is set apart from the other lines and then merges with the other lines and creates units of two lines or three lines which merge with subsequent lines. It's this balance work that tips back and forth between the poem and its meaning that creates the beauty of the poem. The effect scales from line to stanza and from stanza to poem. Poems are made out of lines, and then they're made out of stanzas, and books are made out of poems, and libraries are made out of books, and cultures are made out of libraries, and worlds are made out of cultures, and galaxies are made out of worlds. This slowly building of contrasting elements up and up and up and up and up, it's what everything is made of. Now, obviously, this is kind of a silly example. So let's look at some historic examples. The oak tree, not interested in cherry blossoms. So we've looked at a couple of haiku by Basho, 17th century Japanese poet. And again, you can see that each of the lines stands alone, but that as you move through the poem, the meaning builds and coalesces. So the first line, the oak tree, just sets an image. It establishes a contrast with the subsequent two lines with the colon. The second line, the oak tree, he's not interested. There's something ironic about the personification of the oak tree. And of course, he's not interested in cherry blossoms. The oak tree is old and gnarled, maybe even ugly, but certainly serious and permanent. The cherry blossoms are young and beautiful. And these are two kind of classic images of Japanese aesthetics: the permanence of the oak tree like Mount Fuji, the impermanence of the cherry blossom only appearing briefly in springtime, and each not caring about the other. By contrast, where the first poem starts with an image of permanence, this one starts with an image of impermanence that is made permanent. A cicada shell. Cicadas are the little insects that burrow down in the roots of trees. They gestate for 17 years. Then they crawl up the tree trunk. And there, they've gone through their state change. They were little grubs in the beginning, and now they have wings. And so they crawl out of the shell of their grub form, and they fly away. And that's the the churring sound that we hear in August. And so all that's left behind of the cicada, once the cicada has flown into the air, is its shell stuck to the side of the tree. And so the cicada shell is this perfect image of impermanence. The cicada is only on that side of a tree for a very brief moment, and yet the shell persists. And the cicadas, as a cycle of nature, persist. So that cicada shell, just that first line, we're left to linger on it, and it contains so much rich meaning. And then, of course, the cicada itself, it sang itself utterly away. Fleas, lice, a horse peeing near my pillow. Of course, every image gets worse. I would bet that most of you had marked this as your least favorite Basho poem. Most students do. But I love how these general images of unpleasantness slowly build, not just in intensity, but in proximity to the poet. The poet, at the time, wandering the Japanese late medieval landscape, playing at being a vagabond, finding anywhere that he can to sleep, covered in fleas and lice, bedding down in stables. We approach him very, very slowly, like a middle-class man seeing how far he can fall. What I find really compelling about Basho's poems is the effect they had on mid-20th century American poetry, where you can see here Richard Brautigan, a famous poet of the Beat generation, writing what is effectively an American haiku. And again, the power of the haiku in its new context is just as powerful. It's all about the lines and how they build. But here, instead of looking at natural imagery, instead of looking at things that are beautiful and comforting, or even terrible and discomforting like the last poem, it's pure American. This is the thing I think that all of us need to struggle with is, how do we take the basic tool set of lineation, look at classic poems that we may like, but not mimic those poems? Because the tool may persist, but the world is different. For Brautigan, this is the truest thing he could know. He sits down, he's hungry, he gets out a Snickers bar, he takes a bite. You're just a copy of all the candy bars I've ever eaten. Again, we come back to these images of impermanence and permanence. The individual candy bar is gone in a moment. But in America, we can make a flavor as permanent as Mount Fuji. Every time you pick up a Snickers bar, a Mars bar, every time you pick up any industrial food, you're tasting a taste that's been there for years, for decades, in some cases even a century. The flavor of a can of Coca-Cola changing only very little over the time span that a tree might grow old. I love this poem too. Brautigan often has these first lines that are totally dislocating. I feel horrible. She doesn't. That by itself tells a whole story, and it might imply that there are these two people in one room together, feeling amidst each other. But we find in the next line, love me. And then we run through a series of lines that are the mourning of a man who's been abandoned. And that final line is so crazy, so unsettlingly surprising, that it throws the whole poem into chaos. And Brautigan does this again and again in his poetry. He has a first line that establishes what seems to be a very standard, approachable poetic image. A middle set of lines which swirl that image around in uncertain ways, and then a final line that's just so ridiculous, and yet so specifically concrete, that you leave the poem bemused. Finally, we can look at a longer poem by Louise Gluck. And again, think about how the individual lines are building one to the next, but then they're creating these total units called stanzas, of which we have 3 here. And then we have the final line, which is set in opposition to the whole set. Even now, this landscape is assembling. The hills darken, the oxen sleep in their blue yoke, the fields having been picked clean, the sheaves bound evenly and piled at the roadside among cinquefoil as the toothed moon rises. This is the barrenness of harvest or pestilence. And the wife leaning out the window with her hand extended as in payment, and the seeds, distinct gold, calling, come here, little one. And the soul creeps out of the tree. Notice how, as I read it, I enunciate those first lines of the stanzas, and then I treat the interior of the stanza as a kind of logical unit, and then the first two stanzas set a series of conditions, and the final stanza acts as a kind of response, as a single line. We're all alone right now, scattered to different houses and different states, maybe for some of us even different countries. I was out yesterday walking in the woods behind my village. Nobody was out of their houses. My family and I, we were totally alone. The grass brown, spring not yet even here, and all we could hear were the geese arguing. And it felt very alone. And my children set to talking about the end of days. All right. Stay sane, guys, and email me when you have questions about poetry. Poems are made of lines.